great to welcome to the program today Eric Turkheimer, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. We are going to be talking about some of the controversies that are now very, very prevalent in some enclaves of the internet, and not only there, including about genetics and environment and IQ. But I think maybe first, just so we're all on the same page, let's talk a little bit about the genesis of what we now know as the modern IQ test, what it can tell us and sort of what it cannot tell us.
Well, I mean, the genesis of it, if that's where we're going to start, is back at the turn of the 20th century. It was invented by French and American investigators, largely in the context of first testing army recruits and later testing immigrants in the United States. Probably the concept of intelligence as opposed to intelligence tests themselves date back a little bit further than that to someone named Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, as a matter of fact, and was a controversial figure, but in many ways an uncontested genius in the Victorian 1870s and 80s. And I think the place to start with IQ is you commonly hear people who either believe that IQ is this deep dive into what a human being is capable of on the one hand, and then people on the other side who say that it's meaningless and that it's just what the IQ tests measure, or it's just a measure of how much money your parents make, or something along those lines. And I think the important thing in thinking clearly about IQ is steering a reasonable course between those two extremes. IQ is a measurable characteristic of people beyond any doubt. If you, I mean, there's a lot of technical stuff, but if you give people a series of mental tests of almost any kind, on average, people who do well on one mental test are going to do well on other mental tests. And if you, in a slightly more sophisticated way, take an average across all those mental tests, you get an IQ score. And what that IQ score is, for sure, we can talk about whether it's anything more than this, but what it is for sure is a measure of how good someone's cognitive functioning is right now at the time they took the test. It's a description of someone, like finding out how depressed they are or anything else that a psychologist might measure. And I think if you view IQ this way, a measure of how well somebody is capable of thinking at the moment, it's not really a very controversial idea, because anybody can look around them and see that some people are functioning at a higher level than others. Some people have bigger vocabularies and can solve harder problems and do better plans. I mean, we all know that. I think what makes the idea controversial is this idea that IQ tests somehow measure this deep thing called innate intelligence. That it's not just how well you're doing right now, but this inner thing that you're born with that constrains how well you possibly can do in the world. And I don't want to say there's no evidence that that's true. I mean, there are sensible people have tried hard things to show that that's true, but it's far from obvious that that's true, and it's very, very difficult to show that it's true.
Can you talk a little bit about, I'm sure there's much more that could be said on that, but there's a lot that sort of follows from this that I want to use as sort of our baseline for establishing our conversation. There is this idea that IQ maybe represents some kind of universal measure of intelligence that's independent of culture, or geography or what have you. And then there's another view that there is some test bias, which is that the test itself is biased towards individuals from certain parts of the world with certain educations, and that it's not as universal as some might point to. Can you give us an understanding of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a question on which there's an absolute answer. I think it's broadly true that among modern people who live in the developed world, certainly in North America and Europe, and in large parts of East Asia as well, uh, where people are basically educated, basically abstract thinking oriented, basically book oriented. The biases in IQ tests are in fact fairly small. I mean, IQ, and as far as that goes, IQ tests are much better than they were when they were first created, when they were obviously biased. And uh, it's really not the case, I don't think, that IQ tests are, at least in obvious ways, biased against, say, poor Americans or something like that. Now, another somewhat farther out part of the IQ world is people who think it's legitimate to wander out into sub-Saharan Africa somewhere with a IQ test kit and find people who have never been to school or only to rudimentary school, had may or may not be illiterate, and the whole culture of taking a test on which you try to get the right answer to get a high score just doesn't make any sense. And I think pushed that hard, yes, tests are obviously biased. And that's important because there are people who actually do that and take the results seriously, which I think is a huge mistake. Uh, so among most of us, I don't think test bias is a huge issue in understanding why some people get higher IQ scores than others.
Fair enough. Your work has shown that, or claimed to show that the environment accounts for about 60% of the IQ variance among low-income children. So let's start with that 60% number. Question one is, what accounts for the variance of the other 40%?
Well, I mean, very, very broadly, genetics, though, well, there are a lot of things to say about that. You have to be very IQ, like everything, any measurable difference you can measure in people, is to one extent or another correlated with our genes. And all that says is that sort of where we start in life and the biological input to who we become winds up correlated with where we end up. It doesn't mean that there are genes for IQ or per se or anything like that. Now, when you talk about those percentages, those percentages are a very, very complicated thing because it's we're talking about a quantity that's called a heritability that varies from 0 to 1 and tells you within a lot of complications about the proportion of differences in people that are accounted for by differences in our genes. One way I like to think about it is it tells you how much more similar we would all be if we were all clones. And it's easy to think when you start thinking about these numbers that IQ or any trait has a heritability, and we do science to find out if the heritability of IQ is 60% or 70% or 40% or 20%, and that's wrong. IQ doesn't have a heritability. The heritability of IQ depends on the situation in which you measure it, and that depends on how much people vary genetically and environmentally. So, in fact, if you gave an IQ test to a bunch of clones, I mean, that's not possible in humans, a huge set of identical twins, everybody exactly the same, the heritability would be 0 because everyone is genetically the same and differences in genes can't account for everything. So anyway, coming back to our study, when people have computed those heritabilities in twins in the past, it's been very common it's very hard to get poor twins in twin studies for a variety of reasons. They don't volunteer for the study. Poor families have better things to do, and we found, we didn't really find it. There was a large American twin study that included a lot of twin children raised in poverty, and what we found in that study is that among very poor children, the heritability of intelligence, the proportion that seemed to be accounted for by genes, was very, very low. It was lower than 40%. It was close to 0% in the poorest children. And then as you proceed up to through the middle class into the upper middle class, there weren't a lot of rich people in this study, genes became more and more important, accounted for more and more of the variance, so by the time you got to the upper middle class, things had almost completely reversed. And that finding, just by the way, has replicated quite well in the United States, where we have a lot of economic and educational inequality, not so much in Europe, where they have a better safety net. But that fits, I think, with a lot of common sense thinking about intelligence, which suggests that bad environments are much more important for intelligence than good environments. It's a lot, I don't mean to be flip about it, but it's a lot easier to make someone dumber than it is to make them smarter, because things that go wrong are much more important. And what I like about that finding is that it gives us a way to take the overall genetics of IQ seriously, whereas at the same time, understanding the critical importance of things like poverty and bad environments and the negative effects that those can have on children while they're growing up.
Let's pause our conversation there. We've been speaking with Eric Turkheimer, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. We'll continue our conversation with him tomorrow. We're continuing our conversation with Eric Turkheimer, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. Where I'd like to pick up our conversation, if we can, is first to sort of get into the topic of race and IQ. Before we talk about the meaning and causality, question one is, are there observable differences in IQ measured by race as race is understood in modern Western society?
Yep.
There are. And can you describe that in a little more detail?
Yeah. So if you give an IQ test to a sample of, I guess we might as well talk about the U.S., American blacks and whites, or a test that is essentially an IQ test, even if it's not intended quite as such, like the SATs or something like that, blacks will score something like 2/3 of a standard deviation, about 10 to 12 IQ points lower. That's just a fact on average. And of course, the important discussion is why that is. And
right. So my immediate follow-up, I mean, given that, so we're working with the sort of same baseline of the data that a lot of people who have become incredibly interested in this topic over the last 3 to 5 years start with. My immediate next question, and you tell me whether this is the correct next question or whether there are intermediate questions to look at, is, do we have reason to believe that the cause of those differences is race itself?
Well, if you mean biological race, then no. I believe strongly that we don't. I mean, it certainly is social aspects of race and the history of slavery and discrimination. I mean, in some ways that's race, but presuming you mean race as a biological construct, I feel very strongly that it doesn't, and that it's in fact irresponsible for people to speculate that it might be. And my strongest feeling about that is that based on the kind of data that we can generate in human beings, it's not only that there's no evidence that that's true, though that's the case, there is no evidence that that's true. It's also that there's no possible evidence that it's true. It's not like we're waiting for somebody to complete a study that's going to be decisive.
Well, that was going to
And
be my next question, which is hypothetically, what type of evidence, if you could imagine it, would tell us that IQ differences between races are specifically because of race? Is that even a possibility?
I mean, here's the way I think that could turn out to be true. I mean, I don't, and my point is that this is very unlikely to happen. Uh, if we some what doesn't exist, even though IQ is heritable, like everything about people is heritable, there are no in the normal range, aside from Down syndrome and things like that. There are in the normal range, the difference between your IQ and mine. There are no known genetic mechanisms that determine your IQ. That, oh, well, okay, David has genes X, Y, and Z, and Eric has genes A, B, and C, and we know that it's always true that people with X, Y, Z genes have higher IQs than A, B, C genes, and we, especially if we ever understood the mechanism, because you can see here's what X, Y, Z genes do to your brain and enhance the neurons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because of that, people with those genes are smarter pretty much all the time, not contingent on anything else. If that were true, well, then you could find a group of people that had those genes and a group of people that didn't have those genes and say, well, the difference between those groups seems like it's caused by those genes. And that might apply to American blacks and whites, and it might not, but it's going to explain the difference between some groups that have them and groups that don't have them. But it's those mechanisms that are exactly what's missing. All we know is that genes in individuals are correlated with IQ at the end of the day. And we have absolutely no reason why or how. And because of that, we have no way of knowing whether if the world changed, so if 200 years from now, slavery is finally far enough back in the rearview mirror that it's not affecting people anymore, and Jim Crow and discrimination too, and all the racism that still goes on today, that's finally deep in the past. The genetics of race people have to say the mechanisms of IQ are such that blacks will still score lower on IQ tests, and there's simply no way. There's simply no way to know that. And if you're just betting on the probabilities, there's no reason to think that something like that would ever come out to be true. You have to remember that, 120 years ago, at the turn of the century, when IQ tests were first coming online, people from Southern Europe, Italians and Greek people, had lower IQs, and because those were the people who were emigrating, and Jews for that matter, and because those were the people who were emigrating to the United States, it was a big deal, and people thought the exact same thing, that wow, those people, they have lower IQs, it must be because of their genes. And it's not that somebody's done a big scientific experiment that showed, oh, no, Greek people, they're okay, it's not their genes after all. It's just that time has gone by, and Greek immigrants have recovered from whatever hardships they were experiencing when they first immigrated here, and nobody thinks about it anymore. And in the absence of any reason to think otherwise, that's what we should expect to happen in the long run with blacks and whites. Except, of course, what has been done to blacks over the last 500 years in North America is far worse than what's been done to any other group, and it's going to take longer. These things don't change fast, and I think one of the problems is that these kinds of deficits and disadvantages change over a time period that's longer than an individual human life. So it's like watching the hour hand on a clock, And I think a big part of the motivation for people who think, well, God, this has got to be genetic, is they've been looking at it for 20 or 30 years, and the gap hasn't gotten, it's gotten a little smaller, but it hasn't gotten all that much smaller. And I
Well,
think,
that's
well,
what I
damn.
wanted to ask you about next. I mean, you've spoken to a variety of different people about this issue. I saw an interview you did with Stefan Molyneux. Do you attribute bad faith to the movement that wants to explain IQ differences by saying they are because of race? Or do you attribute ignorance or this sort of short span of time that you're pointing out?
I guess I can't characterize everybody that thinks that. Uh, there are, I mean, one thing I've become aware of, and it'll happen again when this interview gets out on Twitter. I mean, especially outside the professional community, there are just a lot of, here in America, people are fascinated with race, and for a lot of people, they're fascinated with race in kind of a negative way. And there are a lot of racist people out there who just want to believe that because it confirms their presuppositions about the world. In the professional world, it's more complicated. I do know some presumably professional people who I think are motivated by racism on this issue. I know other people who, I think are motivated by a genuine scientific impulse that here's this persistent difference. They want to understand why it happens. And especially in the, in the very contemporary world that, I find there's a tendency on sort of the center right, if I can say it that way, the academic center right, it's become so important to a lot of people to not to give in to what they view as the PC campus culture, blah, 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 that it's very important to them to entertain seriously anything that seems like a scientific hypothesis. So when somebody says, well, I'm a scientist and I'm not a racist and I'm just soberly investigating the possibility that the IQ gap between the races is scientific, there are a lot of people who feel a scientific responsibility to take that idea seriously. And I think it's wrong to do that, and I think they're making a mistake, but I don't think they're exactly racist in doing it. They're just putting their commitment to academic freedom and freedom of inquiry above their abhorrence of racist hypotheses. And I think that's a mistake, but, well, I said it. I don't ultimately think it's motivated by racism. And how the balance of all those things work out really differs from person to person in a way that's hard for me to characterize broadly.
Last thing I want to touch on in the limited time we have is the following.
Yep.
On the one hand, you've said that it could be a long time until the sort of realities of humans on our planet change such that this gap will be eliminated. You've also indicated that, yes, currently the average intelligence for certain races is higher and lower than for certain others. So my question is more of a speculative one, which is, in the immediate, other than saying, give it another 400 years, is there any mathematical case that you have found is the most effective or scientific case to explain to those who seem convinced that the gap is because of race innately, to sort of disabuse them of those beliefs?
Yeah, well, I think the best way to make that case is via something called the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect is something that was observed by the philosopher and psychologist Jim Flynn, who demonstrated that over the last 75 or 100 years, which is the period of time in which people have been taking IQ tests that are similar enough that we can compare how they were doing back then to how they're doing now. Mm-hmm. People have gotten, over that period of time, everywhere you look, people have gotten way, way smarter, like 20 points smarter. And as countries go from being pre-industrial agricultural countries, especially, to post-industrial modern countries, there's a huge increase in average IQ that can't possibly be genetic. It's way, way, way too short a time frame. And that means that the present day gap between blacks and whites is smaller than the average difference between our grandparents' generation and today. And so what that tells you is that, even though that gap can be frustrating and hard to change, on the scale of how much people's IQs change over time, it's right smack in the middle of what we expect to change as our environment changes. And to me, that's the best reason to think, no, this isn't a fixed aspect of people. It's something fluid that's changing all the time.
We've been speaking with Eric Turkheimer. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. A very interesting topic, and I look forward cautiously to the feedback from this interview. Eric, thank you so much for talking to us about this.
Yeah.